The morning my son-in-law stood in my driveway with a moving truck and a smirk, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't grab his collar. I just looked at the foreclosure notice in my hand, looked at my daughter standing 10 feet behind him with her arms crossed like a stranger, and asked one question. Who authorized this refinancing? My son-in-law's smirk held for exactly 3 seconds. Then something shifted behind his eyes, because he suddenly remembered something he'd apparently forgotten when he was planning all of this. He forgot what I did for 31 years before I retired. Before I get into what happened next, let me tell you who I am. My name is Robert Harmon. I'm 66 years old, and I live in a 4-bedroom house on Clearwater Road in Bend, Oregon, a house I bought 28 years ago when timber prices were still reasonable and a man with a government salary could afford something with a yard. Before I retired 3 years ago, I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division out of Portland. My entire career was built on one skill: finding the things someone tried to hide. A misplaced decimal, a date that didn't line up, a signature that was close but not quite right. In 31 years, I helped put away 84 people for financial fraud. I was good at my job. I was very good at my job. And Marcus, my son-in-law of 4 years, had apparently decided that a retired old man, living alone in Bend, was an easy target. He was wrong. Let me back up to where this really started, because fraud never begins the day you discover it. It begins months earlier, in small moments that feel like nothing at the time. My daughter Claire married Marcus Webb in the spring 4 years ago. He was 34, good-looking in a practiced way, always wearing clothes that cost more than they should for a man who described his job as private equity consulting, which I'd learned over the years meant he raised money from people who didn't ask enough questions and promised returns that didn't exist. I had concerns from the beginning, not dramatic ones, just the low hum of professional instinct that had never entirely left me, even in retirement. Marcus asked too many questions about the wrong things. Not about my health, not about my hobbies, not about the grandchildren Claire and I had briefly discussed having someday. He asked about square footage, about the assessed value of the neighborhood, about whether I'd considered a reverse mortgage. Claire seemed genuinely happy, so I kept my observations to myself. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was 4 months ago, when Claire started visiting more. After 2 years of Christmas calls and occasional Sunday dinners, she suddenly appeared every other week with a warm smile and a reason to drop by. She helped me clean out the garage. She brought groceries without being asked. She sat at my kitchen table and asked about my health with the attentiveness of someone who had recently decided my well-being mattered a great deal to them. I was her father. I wanted to believe it was real. I noticed the way she'd glance at her phone whenever I mentioned finances. The afternoon she asked to use my home office printer, and I came back to find her at my desk instead of standing at the printer. But I told myself I was being paranoid. That 31 years of watching people lie had made me see angles where there were none. Then Marcus started coming along. He'd walk through my house with the casual ease of someone taking inventory, run his hand along the kitchen countertop, peer out at the back lot, ask me, with a friendly tilt of his head, whether the half-acre behind the property had ever been subdivided. I'd answer. I was polite, and I watched. I watched Claire watching him. I watched the way her expression went careful and blank whenever he started talking about real estate. Something was happening. I just didn't yet know exactly what. The morning I found out was a Thursday in early October. I was on the back porch with coffee when a silver sedan I didn't recognize pulled up out front. The man who got out was mid-40s, dark suit, carrying a manila envelope with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd been trained to look official. He knocked twice, and when I answered, he identified himself as a representative from a firm called Pacific Crest Asset Resolution. He was very sorry, he said. He understood this was difficult. He handed me the envelope. Inside was a foreclosure initiation notice. According to the documents, I had refinanced my mortgage 8 months ago, pulling out $240,000 in equity against the property. I had missed 4 consecutive payments. The property was now in default. I had 30 days. I read it twice, slowly, the way I'd trained myself to read documents when I needed to understand every word before I reacted. Then I looked up at the man from Pacific Crest Asset Resolution. I didn't refinance this property, I said. He looked uncomfortable. Sir, the application was submitted in your name. We have your signature on the loan agreement. Whose notarization? He blinked. I'm sorry? The loan documents. Who notarized them? He shuffled through his copy. A Thomas V. Ardell, licensed notary, Portland. I thanked him. I told him I'd be in touch with my attorney. I closed the door, and I stood in my entryway for exactly 1 minute, breathing steadily, the way I used to before I walked into an interview room with a subject who thought they'd covered everything. Then I called my daughter. She answered on the second ring, voice bright and ordinary. Dad, hey, what's up? There's a foreclosure notice on my house, Claire. Someone took out $240,000 against my property 8 months ago. I need you to come over. Bring Marcus. There was a pause. Short, but there. The kind of pause I'd spent a career listening for. Oh my gosh, she said. That sounds like some kind of scam, some identity theft thing. We'll be right there. They arrived 40 minutes later. Marcus came in first with the practiced concern of someone who'd rehearsed his expression. Claire stood slightly behind him. And that detail, that small positioning detail, her deferring to him even as they walked through my front door, told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to unfold. Marcus sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands folded, his face arranged into careful sympathy. Robert, I'm so sorry. This is obviously some kind of identity fraud. We need to get your bank on the phone right now. Freeze everything. He reached for his phone. I know a guy at a fraud recovery firm. He handles exactly this kind of... Before we call anyone, I said, I'd like to see the refinancing documents. The full application package. Marcus's hands slowed on his phone. The foreclosure notice should have the lender contact. We can request those through. I already have a copy. I slid the folder across the table. I'm looking at the signature on page 4. He looked at the folder. He didn't touch it. Okay, it's close, I said. If you didn't know my signature, you'd probably accept it. The R and the H are good. But I've been signing my name for 66 years, and I always break the pen on the crossbar of my capital H. It's a habit I've had since high school. This signature doesn't have that break. Claire's hand, resting on the table, curled very slightly into a fist. Beyond that, I continued, keeping my voice the same flat, calm register I used in depositions. The notary stamp. Thomas V. Ardell. I pulled his license number this morning. Ardell's commission expired 14 months ago. He's been unlicensed since August of last year. No legitimate mortgage company processes a loan with an expired notary stamp unless no one was looking very carefully at the documentation. The kitchen was very quiet. There's a third thing, I said. I received the foreclosure notice this morning, but I checked my mail yesterday, and there was nothing. Which means someone has been intercepting my mail, redirecting statements and correspondence so I wouldn't see the payment demands coming. I looked at Marcus. I looked at my daughter. Neither of them spoke. A mail redirection request, I said, requires a signature. I'd be curious to know whose name is on that request. Marcus stood up. The sympathetic expression was gone. What replaced it was something harder, something cornered. You're making some pretty serious accusations here, Robert. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, I said. I'm describing what the documents show. There's a difference. I spent 31 years making that distinction for a living. He looked at Claire, one of those looks that long-married couples develop, a whole sentence compressed into a glance. She looked at the table. We should talk to a lawyer before this conversation goes any further, Marcus said. That, I told him, is the first reasonable thing you've said this morning. They left. I sat at my kitchen table and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel what I was feeling, which was the grief of it more than the anger. The grief of a father watching his daughter stand behind a man who had just tried to steal from her own parent and not saying a word. Then I closed that door and went to work. I still had contacts. 31 years leaves a long trail of people who owe you professional respect, if not outright favors. By noon, I had reached Patricia Morrow, a former colleague now working financial crimes at the Oregon Department of Justice. I didn't ask her to do anything improper. I told her what I'd found, walked her through the document discrepancies, and asked her if the name Marcus Webb appeared in any open investigations. She called me back in 2 hours. Robert, she said carefully, I can't discuss open case files. What I can tell you is that you should talk to a real estate attorney today. Not tomorrow, today. I already had an appointment set. Sandra Okafor, property fraud specialist, downtown Bend. She was sharp and fast, and didn't use unnecessary words, which I appreciated. When I laid the documents across her desk, she examined them the same way I had, methodically, starting with the signature and working outward. The notary issue alone is enough to challenge the loan, she said. An expired commission invalidates the notarization. Without valid notarization, the mortgage agreement is unenforceable. She looked up. Do you know who submitted this application? I have a strong suspicion. We should get a handwriting expert to formally analyze the signature. And I'd recommend a private investigator to trace the mail redirection. She set down her pen. This is going to get complicated if family members are involved. I've been through complicated before, I said. Her name was Dennis Cho, and he came recommended through Sandra as someone who specialized in financial fraud investigations. He was 50-something, quiet, with the unhurried manner of a man who understood that patience was the actual tool. When I explained what I needed, he listened without interrupting, which I respected. Give me 72 hours, he said. In those 72 hours, I went through every document in my house, every paper Claire had asked me to look at over the past 4 months. 3 times she'd brought me things to sign tax adjustment forms, she'd said, beneficiary updates on an old policy, a consent form related to my late wife's estate archive. I'd glanced at the headers. I'd trusted my daughter. 2 of the 3 were exactly what she'd described. The third, a 2-page document with a financial institution's letterhead, was a power of attorney for property matters. Broad, clean, and signed with a version of my signature that was slightly better than the one on the mortgage documents. Someone had been practicing. I photographed it, sent it to Sandra, and called Dennis. I may have found the source document, I said, the one they used to practice the signature. Dennis was quiet for a moment. How many documents did she bring you total? 3 that I can confirm. Okay. That's actually helpful. It means they needed your signature and didn't have reliable access to forge it cleanly. They were still refining. The mortgage application signature isn't perfect, I said, but it was good enough to pass a clerk's review. Most forgeries are, Dennis said. People look for obvious problems, not subtle ones. Unless someone's specifically trained to look, which was exactly what Marcus had been counting on. A retired old man in Bend who would see a foreclosure notice and panic, who might assume he'd simply forgotten signing something, who might, humiliated and confused, take whatever arrangement Marcus offered to make it stop. A few months' rent, maybe. Some arrangement that kept the peace and got Marcus the equity he needed. He had no idea I could read a document the way a musician reads a score. Dennis delivered his full report on a Tuesday evening, sitting in my living room with a folder that he opened with the careful respect of someone handling evidence, which is exactly what it was. Marcus Webb has been operating a private real estate investment fund for the past 2 years, Dennis said. He's collected just over $380,000 from 11 investors, mostly retirees in the Portland Bend corridor. The fund is called Pacific Summit Property Partners. The pitch is that he acquires undervalued residential properties, renovates, and resells at profit. Investors are promised 12% annual returns. I already knew where this was going. There are no properties. There are 2, Dennis said. Both purchased with investor money, both currently listed as collateral on separate fraudulent loan applications. Neither has been renovated. The properties are essentially sitting empty, while Marcus uses new investor deposits to make small payments to early investors to keep them quiet. He turned a page. He's been doing this for 2 years. The fund is roughly 8 months from collapse. He needs a significant cash injection to avoid investor demands he can't meet. $240,000, I said. $240,000, Dennis confirmed. Pulled from your equity through a forged loan application, with the payments redirected so you wouldn't notice until it was too late to unwind it cleanly. And Claire? Dennis's expression didn't change. Claire appears on the fund's promotional materials as Director of Investor Relations. She attended at least 6 investor meetings in the past 18 months. She's aware of the fund's structure. I sat with that for a while. Not because it surprised me somewhere behind my professional assessment. I had already understood it, but because knowing something and hearing it confirmed by a report are 2 different weights. There's one more piece, Dennis said. He slid a printed email exchange across the table. Marcus has been communicating with a man named Glenn Farrell. Farrell runs a consulting service called Estate Transition Advisors. His client list, from what I could find through public filings and court records, is exclusively people who have been investigated for elder financial exploitation. I read through the emails. Farrell was methodical, detailed. He'd coached Marcus on which documents to target, how to layer the mail redirection so it wouldn't trigger postal fraud flags immediately, how to construct a POA that looked routine. He'd even suggested using an expired notary, noting that most lenders processed applications through automated systems that checked for notary formatting but didn't always verify active licensing in real time. This was planned, I said. From the beginning, Dennis said. About 9 months of planning, based on the email timestamps. I looked out the window at my back lot, the half-acre that Marcus had asked about with such casual interest. The half-acre my wife and I had bought together, that I'd mowed every summer since she passed. Thank you, Dennis, I said. Send everything to Sandra Okafor. Sandra moved fast. Within 3 days, she had filed to invalidate the mortgage on the grounds of forged signature and expired notary, accompanied by a forensic handwriting analysis from an expert named William Tate, who had testified in over 200 financial fraud cases and whose opinion on my signature carried exactly the professional weight it needed to. The loan was frozen pending investigation. The foreclosure process halted. Simultaneously, Patricia Morrow, on her own timeline, through her own channels, opened a formal investigation into Pacific Summit Property Partners. I didn't orchestrate that second piece. I had simply made sure the right information was in the right hands. The justice system does its own work when it has what it needs. I'd spent a career learning that truth. 2 weeks after the documents were filed, Marcus showed up at my house unannounced. It was a Sunday afternoon. I saw his car pull in from the kitchen window and I didn't hurry to the door. I let him knock twice before I opened it. He looked different from the last time I'd seen him. Thinner in the face. The careful polish was still there, but underneath it was something worn down and desperate that I recognized from interview rooms. The look of a man who has run the numbers and doesn't like the answer. Robert, he said, we need to talk. Come in, I said. He sat at the same kitchen table as before, but nothing about him was the same. The folded hands, the measured sympathy, all gone. He leaned forward with the directness of someone who'd decided there was no longer anything to lose by being direct. I know you've filed to block the foreclosure, he said, and I know you've been talking to people. I need you to understand that if this goes to court, it's going to get very public and very ugly. Your daughter will be caught in the middle of it. Her name is on those fund documents. She could face charges. She is caught in the middle of it, I said. She's been in the middle of it since she walked into my house with papers for me to sign. She was trying to help me, Marcus said. She didn't fully understand. She stood in my driveway this morning, I said, when the asset resolution representative showed up. She stood there and watched them hand me a foreclosure notice on my own home, and she didn't say a word. Marcus was quiet. I have emails, Marcus, between you and Glenn Farrell. 9 months of planning, step by step. I let that sit between us. Claire isn't an innocent bystander, but I'm her father, and that means something to me regardless of what she's done. The best thing that happens for Claire right now is if you cooperate with the investigation and reduce your exposure as much as possible. Because what you will not do is put her name forward as the primary party in order to protect yourself. Are we clear on that? He stared at me. You'd help her? After what we tried to do? I'd help her become someone who faces what she did and deals with it honestly. That's all I can offer her. I stood up, which indicated the conversation was finished. Talk to a lawyer, Marcus, a real one, and understand that the Oregon Department of Justice investigation is not something I control or can stop. That train has already left. He left without another word. What happened after that moved the way these things move when the evidence is clean and the timeline is documented and no one involved is sophisticated enough to have covered every trail. Sandra's challenge to the mortgage was upheld. The forged loan agreement was voided. My equity was restored. The Department of Justice investigation into Pacific Summit Property Partners took 4 months to conclude. At the end of it, Marcus was charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and 2 counts of mortgage fraud. The 11 investors he'd collected from retired teachers, a landscaping contractor, a woman in her 70s who'd given him $60,000 she'd saved over 40 years, were designated as victims eligible for restitution. Glenn Farrell, the consultant who had coached Marcus through the process, was charged separately with conspiracy and faced his own proceeding. Marcus's attorney attempted a version of the same argument I'd seen a dozen times in my career. Client was a confused, overwhelmed entrepreneur, The fraud was a result of poor business decisions rather than intent, and a harsh sentence would punish a young man for a first-time mistake. The judge was not receptive. The evidence of planning the emails, the 9 months of documentation, the deliberate targeting of a retired father-in-law made the argument collapse under its own weight. Marcus received 5 years in federal prison, plus full restitution to all 11 investors. Claire's case was handled separately. She cooperated with prosecutors once it became clear that cooperation was the only path that didn't end with her own prison sentence. She received 24 months of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and a mandatory financial fraud education program. The judge's words to her were quiet and measured, the way a sentence lands hardest when it doesn't need to be loud. "You used your father's trust as a tool," he said. "Whatever your motivations, that is a betrayal with a very long shadow." She didn't look at me when he said it. I didn't look away. Glenn Farrell received 3 years. His consulting practice was dissolved. The professional circle he'd operated in the network of people who specialized in telling others how to exploit their families got a little smaller. The week after sentencing, Sandra called to confirm that the title on Clearwater Road was fully clear. No liens, no encumbrances, no pending claims. Just my name on my house, the same as it had been for 28 years. That evening, I sat on the back porch and watched the sun go down behind the ridge. The half-acre stretched out behind me, the grass grown a little long from weeks of neglect, while I'd been dealing with attorneys and investigators and court filings. I'd need to mow it soon. There was also a section of fence along the eastern edge that had been needing repair since the spring. A whole list of ordinary, small things that had been waiting while larger things demanded attention. I thought about my 31 years tracking financial fraud. All the cases I'd worked, all the people I'd watched try to game systems they didn't fully understand. The ones who got caught always had the same blind spot. They could see the money clearly. They couldn't see the trail. They counted on the target being too trusting, too confused, or too embarrassed to look closely. They never stopped to consider that the person they were stealing from might know exactly where to look and exactly what they were seeing. Marcus had looked at a 66-year-old man alone in a house in Bend and seen an opportunity. He hadn't asked himself how I'd spent those 31 years. He hadn't asked himself what a forensic accountant does for a living. He'd seen the white hair and the quiet retirement and assumed that was the whole story. People make that mistake about retired professionals more than they should. There was something from Dennis's report that stayed with me past the sentencing, past the legal resolution, past all of it. In one of the email exchanges with Farrell, Marcus had written, "Her dad is completely checked out. Spends all his time in the garage with old furniture. I don't think he even balances his checkbook anymore." I balanced my checkbook every month. I always had. It was a habit, like the way I broke my pen on the crossbar of my H when I signed my name. The small, consistent things that accumulate over a lifetime and become, in the end, the evidence of who you actually are. I did receive one letter, about 6 weeks after sentencing. Claire's handwriting on the envelope, the careful cursive she'd had since middle school. I sat with it unopened on my kitchen table for most of a morning, drinking coffee, watching the light move across the floor, the way it does in October when the sun stays low. Then I opened it. She wrote about remorse in the careful language of someone who had been told to write about remorse and was trying to mean it. She wrote about Marcus's influence and the slow erosion of her own judgment. She wrote that she understood now what she'd asked me to sign, that she had known even then and had told herself the story she needed to tell herself. She didn't make excuses exactly, or she tried not to. She asked if we could talk sometime. Not now. Someday, when the right amount of time had passed. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of the old writing desk I keep in my office. Not to forget it. Just to let it be there, in the same space as the rest of the things I've collected over a life, the things that matter and the things that hurt and the things that are both at once. I went back out to the garage. There was an oak side table I'd been working on for 2 months, a piece from the 1930s with beautiful bones and decades of damage. The kind of thing that most people would have thrown out. I'd been stripping it back layer by layer, finding what was underneath. It was slow work. It required patience and attention and the willingness to keep going on the days when the damage looked worse than you'd expected. Some things take a long time to restore. Some things you can't restore at all. The work is in learning to tell the difference, and in not giving up on the ones that still have something worth saving. I picked up the scraper and got back to it. The afternoon light in Bend in October, is something worth noticing. I had the time. I had my house. I had the long, quiet satisfaction of a man who paid attention to the details when it mattered, and who knows has always known that the truth reveals itself. If you're patient enough to look.